The dense forest stretched endlessly beneath a fading summer sun, the towering pines casting long shadows over the narrow dirt trail winding its way deep into the heart of the Cascades. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and pine needles, carrying with it the quiet chorus of rustling leaves and distant bird calls. For Emma Collins, the wilderness was more than a sanctuary. It was home, a place where the chaos of life faded into the steady rhythm of her boots on the forest floor and the steady breath in her lungs. At 28, Emma was a seasoned hiker and environmental biologist, driven by a passion to preserve these wild places she loved. She knew these woods like the back of her hand, every creek, every ridge, every hidden clearing. But on this late August afternoon, something felt different. She had planned a solo hike along a remote section of the Pacific Crest Trail, a path she'd walked many times before. Her car was parked at the trailhead, a dusty clearing near the edge of a small logging town called Cedar Hollow, nestled at the foot of the mountains. Emma's fiancé, Mark, had dropped her off earlier that morning, his usual easy smile tinged with quiet worry. They'd argued briefly before she left, something about the upcoming wedding, the stress of moving to a new city. Emma brushed it off. She needed this hike, the silence, the space to breathe. She kissed him goodbye, promising to call once she reached the summit. But that call never came. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Mark's concern grew. Hours passed with no word. When the local ranger station closed for the night, without any report from Emma, Mark knew something was wrong. He contacted the sheriff's department, his voice trembling as he reported her missing. The search began at dawn, with teams of deputies, volunteer hikers, and park rangers combing the area. Helicopters scanned the tree canopy, while search dogs sniffed through underbrush and fallen logs. But the forest was vast, dense, and unforgiving. Days passed. Emma's car remained untouched at the trailhead, keys still in the ignition, backpack, and gear left neatly inside. There was no sign she'd ever left the parking lot, no footprints, no broken branches, no discarded items on the path. It was as if she had simply vanished. The local community was shaken. Cedar Hollow was a small town where everyone knew each other, and the forest was both a playground and a lifeline. Rumors swirled. Some whispered about dangerous wildlife. Others speculated about a stranger lurking in the woods. A few feared darker possibilities. At the sheriff's office, Detective Laura Green took the lead on the case. A pragmatic woman with sharp eyes and a reputation for persistence. Laura had seen her share of disappearances and lost hikers, but something about Emma's case unsettled her. The lack of evidence, the untouched car, the silence from the forest itself, it didn't add up. Laura delved into Emma's life, piecing together a portrait of a woman loved by family and friends, known for her kindness and determination. She discovered Emma's last known text message to Mark, a brief note saying, "At the base of the ridge, going up now. Call you soon." But no call ever came. As the search stretched into weeks, the forest seemed to swallow hope along with the fading sunlight. One day, a volunteer searching a seldom-used trail reported a faint footprint, too small for a grown woman, too clear to be mistaken. It led off into thick brush and then disappeared. Theories multiplied. Had Emma encountered someone? Had she fallen? Was she hiding? Laura organized a forensic team to examine the car more closely. They found nothing unusual, no signs of struggle or theft. Emma's phone was found in the glove compartment, battery dead. No incoming calls or messages. The trail grew colder, the mystery deeper. Yet the forest seemed to watch, holding its secrets tight. At night, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the weight of unanswered questions. The case drew national attention. Missing persons posters appeared in nearby towns. Social media campaigns sparked hope and despair. Emma's family refused to give up, organizing search parties, reaching out to psychics and wilderness experts, desperate for a clue. But the forest remained silent. On the 30th day after Emma's disappearance, Laura sat alone in the sheriff's office, sifting through pages of reports and witness statements. A single phrase caught her eye in one report from a retired forest ranger who'd hiked near the trail weeks before Emma vanished. Saw a shadow, like a figure, standing just beyond the tree line. Didn't move, didn't speak. Just watched. Laura felt a chill run down her spine. Was it a trick of light, a wild animal, or something more? She stared out the window at the darkening forest, the same one that had swallowed Emma without a trace. Somewhere beneath those towering pines, secrets waited to be uncovered, secrets that might explain the silence, the disappearance, and the shadow in the woods. What had happened to Emma Collins? And would the forest ever reveal its truth? The search was far from over. If this story gripped you, hit like, share your theory in the comments, and subscribe for more mysteries. Who do you think, or what do you believe is behind Emma's disappearance? Could the forest itself be hiding more than just trees? The morning fog curled low over Cedar Hollow, blurring the outlines of pines and turning the gravel road to the trailhead into a pale ribbon disappearing into gray. And by the time the search crews gathered, the sun had only begun to pierce through the mist, glinting off the windshields of trucks lined up like sentinels along the edge of the woods, their back doors open to reveal ropes, lanterns, thermal cameras, and crates of water and energy bars. And Detective Laura Green stood among them, arms crossed, scanning each face as she gave instructions in a steady, low voice that carried the weight of urgency, dividing the volunteers and deputies into groups, assigning sections of the trail to sweep, reminding them of the landmarks, the ridges, the dangerous ravines where a misstep could cost someone their life. And she felt the tension in the air, the tight coil of worry that had been winding for weeks, not loosening despite the passing days, and the sound of search dogs barking, impatiently added to the chaos, their handlers kneeling to adjust harnesses before letting them sniff Emma's jacket one more time, hoping to capture a scent that had long since been scattered by wind and rain. But hope was a stubborn thing in Cedar Hollow, and as the groups pushed into the trees, the townspeople remained behind at the ranger station, some whispering prayers, others clutching maps and radios, their faces pale with worry. And Laura moved quickly along the narrow trail, the crunch of dry pine needles underfoot blending with the distant hum of a helicopter that swept low over the ridges, its blades stirring the canopy as spotters scanned the ground below with binoculars. And she thought about Emma's car, still sitting silent at the trailhead, untouched, the keys dangling from the ignition as though waiting for her return, the glove compartment still holding her phone like an artifact frozen in time. And as they passed the first-mile marker, one of the deputies called out, holding up a scrap of blue fabric caught on a thorny bush, and Laura's heart leapt before she realized it was only an old rag left by another hiker long ago, and the disappointment settled heavy in her chest. But she forced herself to keep going, to keep scanning the underbrush, calling Emma's name into the stillness, her voice echoing and fading, and deeper into the woods they went, where the sunlight broke into shards through the thick canopy, and the air grew cooler, damper, carrying the earthy scent of moss and distant water. And then a searcher shouted, drawing them all toward a shallow creek, where something pale caught the light among the rocks, and Laura pushed through brambles to see a single shoelace, frayed and muddied, snagged between stones, and she crouched to pick it up, her fingers brushing against wet grit as she bagged it carefully, wondering if it belonged to Emma or someone else entirely. And though it was no proof, it sparked a surge of energy in the searchers, sending them combing along the banks in tighter grids, eyes scanning for more. But nothing else emerged from the creek's slow current, and as the day stretched on, the temperature rose, sweat beading on brows, voices growing hoarse from calling, the shadows lengthening as evening approached, and Laura gathered the teams back at the trailhead, her notebook full of coordinates and notes, but none leading to Emma. And Mark was waiting there, eyes bloodshot, his hands twisting a photograph of Emma smiling in the sun. And when Laura shook her head, his face crumpled, though he said nothing, just stared out at the forest as though willing her to walk out of it. And the search continued the next day, and the next, with fresh volunteers arriving from nearby towns, bringing drones equipped with infrared cameras to sweep the densest parts of the woods. And each time something moved in the footage, hearts raced, but it was always a deer or a shadow cast by wind-tossed branches. And as nights fell, lanterns flickered in the base camp, where people huddled over maps, tracing trails with calloused fingers, debating whether Emma could have crossed the ridge, or if someone had taken her in a car before anyone noticed. And whispers began to spread of a white pickup truck seen near the trail on the day she vanished, a local hunter mentioning it to deputies. But when Laura followed up, The lead fizzled out, the description too vague, the timing uncertain, and with each passing day, the weight in her chest grew heavier. Yet she refused to let the search falter, even as the sheriff muttered about the cost, the overtime hours, the strain on the department, because in the photographs of Emma that stared back from every bulletin board in town, Laura saw someone who deserved more than to be forgotten in the shadows of the trees. And late one evening, as she walked back to her car, exhausted, she paused at the trailhead, staring into the dark, feeling the cool night air brush her skin. And in that moment, she thought she saw movement far down the trail, a flicker of white between the trunks, and she took a step forward, heart pounding, calling Emma's name softly. But the shape vanished, leaving only the sigh of wind through leaves, and she stood frozen, wondering if exhaustion was playing tricks on her mind or if the forest was trying to tell her something. But when she returned to the station to write her report, she could still feel that eerie sense of being watched, as though unseen eyes followed her from somewhere deep in those woods, waiting. If this story has you on edge, hit like, share your theory in the comments, and subscribe for part 3. What do you think Laura saw in the darkness? Weeks turned into months, and the frantic energy that once filled the ranger station ebbed into a muted routine of unanswered calls, fading leads, and paper files stacked high with maps scrawled in red marker. And Laura Green sat late at night under the flicker of an old desk lamp, staring at Emma's smiling photo clipped to the board above her desk, feeling the slow, creeping weight of defeat settle over the investigation, because despite endless sweeps of Cedar Hollow, the forest kept its secrets tightly bound beneath layers of pine needles and shadow. And one by one the search teams dwindled. The volunteers returned to their lives. The helicopters no longer patrolled the skies, leaving only the rustling of leaves and the low hum of insects in the empty clearings where searchers once gathered. And Mark came by less often, his eyes hollow, voice quiet, leaving flowers at the trailhead and standing in silence before disappearing back down the gravel road. And Laura tried to fight the growing sense that the woods had swallowed Emma whole. But the case files were growing cold, the evidence stale, the sheriff's budget tight, and eventually the official search was suspended, leaving Laura with only the unspoken promise she had made to herself that she would not let the silence be the last word. Yet the week stretched on, and Cedar Hollow's rhythms resumed. Hikers returned, families picnicked. The summer sun glared down on the trails as if nothing had happened. But for those who remembered, there were scars, whispered stories around diner counters, speculative theories traded online, and Laura often scrolled through forums late at night, reading threads filled with strangers dissecting every detail of Emma's disappearance, some convinced it was an accident, others murmuring about darker possibilities. And one night, scrolling past a grainy photo someone posted of a figure deep in the woods, Laura felt a chill trace her spine, though she knew it was probably doctored. But it reminded her of that night at the trailhead when she thought she saw movement in the dark, and she closed her laptop, rubbed her tired eyes, and told herself she couldn't keep chasing ghosts. Yet a year later, when a teenage boy went missing briefly while hiking near Cedar Hollow, the old fears surged through the town like wildfire. Reporters returned, cameras flashed, and Laura was called back in to consult, her heart hammering as she retraced old paths. But the boy was found. By nightfall, disoriented but unharmed, claiming he had gotten lost. And though the relief was palpable, it opened wounds that had never healed, and Laura found herself back at the station that night, pulling out Emma's file, running her fingers along the edge of the photograph, whispering a quiet apology for letting time slip by. And she wasn't alone in her obsession, for Mark still lit candles every month by the trailhead, and Emma's sister, Jenna, started a social media campaign posting old videos of Emma laughing on hikes, their childhood spent exploring trails, each post a plea for information. And though the algorithms pushed her content briefly into strangers' feeds, no new tips surfaced, only condolences. And so the case became something of a legend, parents warning their kids not to wander too far into the trees, hikers leaving small cairns on trails as a silent memorial, and Laura, though transferred to another department, kept a copy of the map pinned behind her new desk, the red markings fading but never erased. And at night, she sometimes dreamed of Cedar Hollow, of Emma's voice calling faintly through the branches, of a shadow slipping just out of view. and she would wake with her heart racing, feeling as though some piece of the puzzle hovered just beyond her reach, waiting for the right moment to surface. And that moment would come, though not as she expected, because years later, long after the media attention had faded and the trailhead signs had been replaced, a retired botanist named Glenn, who loved solitary hikes, wandered deep into a part of the forest no search team had thoroughly combed, drawn by the promise of rare orchids, and as his boots crunched through a bed of leaves, he noticed something strange jetting from the soil, a sliver of faded blue fabric, and curiosity got the better of him as he brushed away the dirt, revealing the corner of a weathered backpack, and as he tugged it free, he felt his breath catch at the sight of a keychain dangling from the zipper, a small silver compass identical to the one Emma's sister had described in countless interviews, and Glenn froze, staring at the forest around him, feeling suddenly watched, the silence thick and unnatural, and though he didn't know whose backpack it was, he knew enough to call the authorities, and when the call came through, Laura's pulse spiked as she raced back to Cedar Hollow, her fingers gripping the steering wheel, a thousand questions flooding her mind. And when she saw the dirt-smudged backpack laid out on a tarp, she felt the air leave her lungs, her heart pounding as she unzipped it with trembling hands, revealing a crumpled map, a water bottle, and a journal, its cover warped from years of weather, the pages within swollen and stained, and as she turned the first page under the dim light of the station, she saw Emma's handwriting, shaky but unmistakable, and though the ink had bled, a few words were clear enough to raise the hairs on Laura's neck. If someone finds this, they were watching us. And the room seemed to shrink around her as she read those words over and over, feeling the weight of years crash down in that instant, knowing that Emma's disappearance was not the simple accident many had begun to believe. And as she looked up, the dark window beside her reflected only her own wide eyes and the empty forest beyond. Yet she could not shake the feeling that somewhere out there, in those endless trees, someone or something was still watching. If this story gripped you, hit like, share your theory in the comments, and subscribe for part 4. What do you think Emma meant in her journal? The morning after the backpack was recovered, the air over Cedar Hollow carried a damp chill as fog wove through the towering pines, and Detective Laura Green stood at the forest's edge staring into the tree-line with the restless energy she had not felt in years, clutching the warped journal in her gloved hands, while her team set up a small mobile command post a few yards away, the sounds of generators humming and radios crackling as rangers, forensic techs, and deputies moved in coordinated silence. And as she turned another fragile page, she could barely make out Emma's faint sentences between water stains, lines like fragments of a nightmare. We heard footsteps last night. The fire went out on its own. There was someone above us. And Laura's mind raced with possibilities, her breath clouding in the cold as she glanced at Mark, who stood behind her, arms folded tightly across his chest, his eyes locked on the bag, like it might still contain a piece of his missing world. And the team fanned out in a grid pattern, pushing deeper into the brush, marking off sections with bright orange tape, while the forest remained unnervingly still except for the occasional caw of a distant crow. And as hours passed, they uncovered more signs. A fragment of fabric snagged on brambles, the snap trekking pole half buried in moss, and each find felt like a whisper from the past, drawing them closer to a truth they weren't sure they wanted. And by late afternoon, one of the rangers radioed in with a tight urgency in his voice, "You need to see this." And Laura followed him over a ridge slick with pine needles until they reached a narrow ravine where the earth had shifted long ago, exposing something metallic beneath layers of roots. And there it was, a rusted car door protruding from the soil, the paint almost gone, but enough remained to see it match the make and model of Emma's vehicle. And Mark staggered forward, dropping to his knees, scraping at the dirt with his bare hands until Laura knelt beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder, whispering that they'd do this carefully. And soon the excavation crew arrived, shovels biting into the ground as they unearthed the buried vehicle inch by inch until the forest revealed a haunting sight. Emma's car entombed in roots and debris, windows shattered, the roof dented, but the most unsettling detail was the roof rack, its bolts twisted as if torn from something heavy that had once been strapped there, and Mark's lips trembled as he whispered, "Her board was there." Remembering the last photo of Emma, smiling in front of the car with that board above her head, and Laura crouched low peering into the car's dark interior, her flashlight beam cutting through dust and leaves revealing 2 faded hiking boots on the back seat, and an empty driver's seat. No blood, no remains, just the eerie sense that the car had been hidden on purpose, and she called forensics over as they began photographing every angle, collecting sample swabbing surfaces while Laura stepped back, scanning the tree line, feeling that same sensation Emma's words described, like eyes on the back of her neck. And night began to creep in, the temperature dropping, fog rising from the ravine floor. And as the text worked, Laura returned to the journal, turning to the last legible page, where Emma had scrawled in shaking lines, "They won't let us leave. They said we were chosen." And Laura felt her throat tighten, her mind darting to every case, file she'd ever read about unsolved disappearances, wondering if Cedar Hollow had been hiding more than just Emma's fate. And as the headlights of approaching vehicles cut through the dusk, she saw Sheriff Douglas step out, his expression grim but determined, telling her quietly, "We've got something else." And he handed her a plastic evidence bag containing a weathered lanyard with an ID badge still tucked inside the plastic sleeve. The photo almost faded, but the words clear enough. Cedar Hollow Research Initiative. Authorized personnel. And Laura felt her heartbeat quicken as the sheriff explained that there were old rumors of a government research station deep in these woods, shut down decades ago and never documented publicly. And the implications churned in Laura's mind like dark water, connecting to Emma's words about being chosen, about someone above them. And she suddenly felt the case crack open in front of her like a fault line, exposing something far larger and older than a simple disappearance. And as the team packed up for the night, a sudden rustling from the trees made everyone freeze, beams of flashlights slicing through the shadows. But nothing emerged, only the echo of branches snapping deeper in the dark, and Mark whispered hoarsely, "Someone's out there," while Laura gripped her sidearm, scanning the dense forest. And though no one spoke, the tension was electric as they retreated to the command post under the pale wash of moonlight. The journal still clutched to Laura's chest. And back at the station, she spread every piece of evidence across a long table, connecting threads of twine between photos, maps, and notes, her eyes lingering on the ID badge, the buried car, the torn fabric, and the final haunting lines in Emma's handwriting. And deep in the night, as the clock ticked toward 3, she thought she heard faint static from the radio, a voice almost too soft to catch, whispering something that sounded like her own name. And she spun around to an empty room, heart racing, convinced for a moment that Emma herself was reaching out across the years from wherever she had been taken. And Laura knew she was close now, too close to stop. And as she closed her eyes for a brief moment, she vowed silently to Emma that she would follow every lead, no matter how dangerous, because the forest was starting to speak, and it would not stop until its story was told. If this part kept you on edge, hit like, share your theories in the comments, and stay tuned for part 5. What do you think the Cedar Hollow Research Initiative was hiding? ChatGPT. The next morning, the fog still clung low to the forest floor when Laura returned to the command post with bloodshot eyes and a mind alive with possibilities. The discovery of the ID badge had ignited something fierce within her and the team as well. And now the place buzzed with activity as analysts spread aerial photographs and old topographic maps across tables, searching for any structure that might have been part of the so-called Cedar Hollow Research Initiative. And Mark sat nearby, clutching Emma's journal as though afraid it would vanish, his thumb brushing over the warped cover, while his eyes darted between the investigators like he was trying to read answers in their faces. And Laura leaned over a dusty archival map, pointing out a faint trail that wound deeper than any official route, a faded annotation in the corner reading Sector 9. And she whispered to herself, wondering why that name never appeared in public park records. And soon her partner, Detective Raines, joined her, carrying a folder of declassified documents he'd begged off a retired ranger who recalled strange convoys moving through these woods decades ago. And as Laura flipped through the yellowed papers, she found references to behavioral testing and extended observation, words that made her stomach churn because they matched too closely with Emma's frantic notes. And then came the call from the lab. Soil samples from the buried car contained trace compounds consistent with old concrete, dust, and synthetic insulation, not something from the natural environment, but from a man-made structure. and Laura's pulse quickened as she ordered a drone sweep over Sector 9, while she and a field team geared up to follow the coordinates on foot, Mark insisting on coming along despite protests, until Laura relented, seeing the fierce determination in his eyes, and together they trekked into the heart of Cedar Hollow, the air thick with the resinous scent of pine and the distant rush of a stream, branches clawing at their jackets as they pushed through overgrown paths long forgotten. And hours later the drone operator's voice crackled over the radio announcing an anomaly ahead, a pattern of straight lines in the terrain that shouldn't exist in nature. And when Laura and the team reached the location, they found it. Moss-covered concrete, protruding from the earth like the bones of a giant, a rusted metal door half hidden under a curtain of vines, and everyone froze. The only sound, their own breathing. And Laura approached slowly, brushing away years of leaves, revealing a faded symbol etched into the steel, a circle bisected by a jagged line, the same symbol she'd seen sketched in the margins of Emma's journal. And Mark's voice broke as he whispered she was here. And Laura motioned the team to ready lights and weapons before pushing the door, which groaned open on ancient hinges, releasing a stale rush of air that smelled of damp earth and something metallic, and they descended a flight of narrow concrete steps, the beams cutting through the dark, revealing a corridor lined with peeling paint and dangling wires, the silence heavy except for the distant drip of water somewhere below. And as they advanced, they entered a large chamber littered with toppled filing cabinets and shattered glass panels, evidence of a hurried evacuation or deliberate destruction. And Laura swept her light across a wall covered in faded notices and found a corkboard with photographs pinned haphazardly, faces of people in outdoor gear with dates scrawled underneath, and there among them was Emma, her smile frozen in time beside two other hikers Laura didn't recognize, and Mark fell to his knees, reaching out to touch the image, as if that alone could pull her back, while Laura's gut twisted at the sight of a handwritten label beneath the photos reading, "Phase 3 candidates." And she pulled out her camera, snapping pictures, her mind racing through possibilities when Rains called out from another room, holding up a dusty reel-to-reel tape recorder and a box of tapes labeled with dates from the year Emma vanished, and Laura's hand shook as she loaded the first tape, the machine whirring to life with a scratchy hum before a voice crackled through, a man's voice, calm and clinical, describing subject conditioning and environmental acclimation. And then there was a faint sob in the background, a woman's voice pleading, and Mark's head snapped up, eyes wide as if he recognized her cry. And suddenly a loud metallic clang echoed through the halls, making everyone jolt. Weapons raised, beams darting to the shadows. But there was nothing there, only the echo of footsteps retreating into darkness. And Laura's heart pounded as she whispered for everyone to stay sharp, her mind torn between cataloging the evidence and confronting the creeping certainty that someone else was still using these halls. And they pressed deeper, finding a locked door reinforced with steel plates, and after some effort with a crowbar it yielded, revealing a smaller chamber lined with old monitors and logbooks, a single light flickering weakly from a ceiling fixture, and on the desk sat a stack of Polaroids showing hikers in various states of confusion or distress, some with strange markings on their arms, and on the last Polaroid was Emma again, eyes wide, a shadowed figure behind her, just out of focus, and Mark gasped, stepping back, covering his mouth as tears welled up, and Laura felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature as she realized this was no accident or random crime. This was a program, a pattern, and it was still alive in some form. And before she could say more, the radio on her belt crackled violently with static, and a distorted voice hissed through the noise, saying her name over and over until it abruptly cut off, leaving a silence so thick it pressed on her ears. And everyone stood frozen in the dim light, staring at one another, questions flooding their eyes, and Laura clenched her fists, knowing they had stumbled onto something far bigger than a cold case, something with roots that ran deep into whatever Cedar Hollow had been hiding for decades. And as they began the trek back to daylight, their packs heavy with evidence, and their minds heavier with dread, Laura made herself a promise. She would not let this trail go cold, not now, not when they were finally tearing open the veil that had hidden Emma's fate. And as they emerged into the pale afternoon light, Mark whispered hoarsely, "We're getting close. I can feel it." And Laura nodded, though inside she felt a gnawing unease that whatever answers they found might not bring peace, but something far more complicated, because the forest itself seemed to hum softly in approval, as if acknowledging that they had awoken something that would not easily be put back to rest. If this part drew you deeper into the mystery, hit like, share your theories in the comments, and get ready for part 6. What do you think they'll uncover next? ChatGPT. Night had fallen by the time Laura and Mark sat in the dimly lit operations tent. The hum of generators and the distant chirp of insects, the only sounds punctuating the weighty silence as officers cataloged evidence around them, and Laura sifted through the reels and photographs again and again, feeling as though every detail carried the key to a truth just out of reach. When the forensic team returned from the lab with an update that sent a tremor through the air, a partial fingerprint lifted from one of the Polaroids matched a park maintenance worker who had lived in the area for decades. A man named Henry Callahan, known in the community as quiet, helpful, the kind who volunteered for search parties and fixed trail signs after storms, and the revelation hit everyone like a physical blow, because he had been among those who had offered condolences to Mark years ago, his calm blue eyes full of empathy. And now Laura found herself in an unmarked SUV creeping down a gravel road leading to his secluded cabin, the moon casting fractured light through the branches as shadows darted across the windshield, Mark in the back seat gripping Emma's journal like a lifeline, his jaw tight, and Laura felt the familiar coil of dread in her gut as they approached the cabin, its windows dark except for the faintest flicker of light within, and they moved in with quiet steps, weapons drawn, until the door creaked open under Laura's hand and the interior spilled into view, a modest space, smelling of cedar and old books, shelves lined with hiking guides and wildlife manuals, a table scattered with maps and, to her horror, more photographs, unfiled, spread like a deck of cards, images of hikers and families over decades, all bearing the same uneasy expressions, and in the corner sat Callahan himself, in a rocking chair, hands folded neatly, his face illuminated by the dim glow of a lantern, and he did not flinch as the officers fanned out around him. Instead, he simply smiled, a thin, brittle smile that made Laura's skin crawl, and he said softly, "I wondered when you'd find that place." His voice calm, devoid of panic, as though they were old friends discussing a shared secret, and Laura demanded to know where Emma was, where the others were, what had been done to them. But Callahan only tilted his head, eyes distant, and murmured, "I never hurt them. We were helping them remember what they'd forgotten." And the words hung in the air like a riddle. Mark stepped forward, voice shaking with fury, demanding answers. But Callahan continued in that unervingly placid tone, explaining how years ago he had been part of a research division tasked with testing human adaptability to extreme environments, how they had recruited hikers, campers, wanderers under false pretenses, and brought them to the underground chambers Laura had seen, subjecting them to sensory experiments meant to erase and rebuild memory. And he insisted that no one had been killed, that they had been released after completion. But their memories were scrambled, their identities fractured. Some wandered back, some vanished forever into the woods. And when Laura pressed him about Emma specifically, his smile faltered, a flicker of something genuine crossing his face, and he whispered, "She was special," she almost remembered, before his gaze drifted to the lantern flame. And at that moment a search team radioed in from another sector, reporting they had found a campsite deep beyond the hollow. 3 disoriented adults sitting around a cold fire, dehydrated but alive, one of them matching Emma's description, and Mark's knees buckled as he heard the transmission, tears springing to his eyes. Laura's throat tightened with disbelief and relief all at once, and they raced through the night, guided by flashlight beams and shouted coordinates until they broke through the tree line, and there she was, Emma, thinner, older, eyes glassy with confusion, but undeniably Emma. And when Mark fell to his knees in front of her, she reached out slowly, uncertainly, as if touching a ghost, whispering his name like it was a distant memory. And the other 2 survivors stared blankly into the darkness, muttering fragments of sentences about endless corridors and bright lights, their words disjointed. And the medics moved in quickly, wrapping blankets around them, checking vitals. But when Laura gently asked Emma what had happened, she only shook her head slowly, tears tracking through the grime on her cheeks, and said, "I don't know. I don't remember. I just woke up." and the pain in Mark's eyes was mingled with joy because she was alive even if the truth remained locked away. And back at the command post, Callahan sat in custody calmly recounting more details to investigators: names, dates, locations of other hidden facilities, a network of secrets stretching beyond Cedar Hollow. And Laura felt a wave of grim satisfaction knowing that at least some answers would come. But she also felt the weight of questions that might never be resolved. Because when she returned to the evidence room later that night and looked again at the shadowy figure in the background of that final Polaroid, she realized it wasn't Callahan. The build and posture were different, and a chill crept up her spine as she wondered how many others had been involved, how many still walked these woods unseen. And as dawn broke over Cedar Hollow, painting the treetops gold, Laura watched Mark cradle Emma's hand by the ambulance, their faces lit with fragile hope, and she stepped aside, letting the moment be theirs, her own heart heavy but resolute, because justice in its purest form might never be complete. But here and now there was life, where there had been only absence. And as she turned to leave, she caught sight of a ranger pinning up a new sign near the trailhead, a simple message in bold letters: "Remember them." And Laura paused, breathing in the cool morning air scented with pine and damp earth, feeling the ache of what had been lost and the quiet triumph of what had been found. And as she walked back toward her car, she glanced once more at the dark tree line, where shadows still shifted and whispered. And she knew the story was not over, not really. But for now there was a measure of peace, a fragile thread of hope binding those who had waited so long. And as the sun rose higher, she felt the forest watching, silent and eternal, keeping its remaining secrets close, daring her to return. If this final chapter moved you, share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us where you're reading from, and subscribe for more stories that keep you on edge. ChatGPT.